Hi, I am Brian Gibbons. Welcome to the fourth and final video in this How to Give a Good Science Presentation series of videos. On this particular video, it's one of my favorites because we're going to be talking about design considerations in terms of how you display the information that you are presenting during your talk. So think back a little bit about some of the presentations that you've seen. You probably don't have to think too long or too hard to think of some presentations you've seen that were very, very nice, very good, looked very nice. Other ones, maybe, again, not so much. Maybe a lot more poor or something about them just did not look as you would like. As we go through today's presentation, what I'd like you to do is to think about those presentations that you've seen before, and also think about some of the things that you typically do when you're making a presentation. What are the design considerations you're already thinking about? And maybe how can you improve upon those using some of the tips in this video. So here's a slide. This basically is kind of a summary of a lot of things that you should do when you're making a presentation, and in order to make especially a text slide look very nice. And one of the things you're probably doing right now while I'm talking is you're probably starting to read through this slide to see what it is that it says, because I'm not talking nearly fast enough, at least in terms of your reading ability. The only point of having this slide in the talk is actually to say, this is a bad example. This is not the typical type of slide that you want to have as part of your presentation, because there's simply far too much text there. You don't want to make a teleprompter. You want to have short, succinct, clear bullets in your slides. And it'll be easier for you to talk extemporaneously, and it will also be easier for your audience to focus on you and not focus on reading the slide instead. You should have 1 to 2 points per slide. And by that, I mean just mainly 1 or 2 things that you're focusing on or that you're talking about. One of the very common sayings that I've grown to appreciate and like very much is omit needless words. So a three-word sentence, really, that basically says almost all you need to know about both writing science reports, science journal articles, and when making science presentations. You want to eliminate as many words as you can, because typically when you say things in the shortest, most succinct possible way, it's also the clearest and it's the easiest to understand. If you don't believe me, you could probably think of some presentations you've seen where you've just been like, come on, get to the point, this is taking way too long. Those people were not following this advice. I've actually seen an example of someone that had a tattoo that said omit needless words on it, which goes to show how important that small phrase is. Specifically, if there is a rule of thumb, I would say 50 words or less, and lean on the or less side of that per slide. You don't need that many words per slide. Some of the best presentations just have a title and then an image all the way through. Those can be very nice. Words are absolutely fine, but you typically want to minimize them. Also, when you're having groups, you should have 4 or fewer groups of items on a slide. So one group might be this pencil tip over here, this point on the left. 2 more groups might be these individual bullets there. So that includes bullets, it includes images. Anything on your slide is a group of items. Only have about 4. More than that, it starts getting a little too cluttered and a little too busy. You should also make sure whatever it is you are writing is visible to the audience or to the reader. This is very good advice for making posters as well as giving presentations. You typically want to use large font sizes. Here you can see some of the font sizes that were used. I believe most of the larger font here is written in size 32 point font. You can also see what size 24, size 20, and size 18 looks like. Size 18 is about the smallest I'm ever really willing to go, with the possible exception that sometimes I will use references that are a little bit smaller in the bottom. Size 24 or larger is usually a really good place to start when you're preparing font sizes. You should also maximize your contrast and don't do what's shown there on the bottom, where you have a very, very light text on a very light background. In that case, it looks like neon green on yellow. It's a very bad color combination in general. And on the right-hand side, it looks like we have black text on a dark blue background. In that case, the opposite error is being made, where the font and the background color are both very dark. So again, maximize contrast. Don't have light on light or dark on dark. And one really important piece of advice that's helped make my presentations a lot better is putting your slide titles to work. So your slide titles, as the quote there says, should not just be there to name the slide. They're not just like a description of the slide. You can put one of the main results or the key results or the main point right up there in your title. So it's doing the work, much like this worker bee here is working for its hive. You want your slide titles to be doing that for you. It's doing their own work in the background, not something that necessarily calls attention to itself, but also doing this will help to eliminate a lot of unnecessary words from your slides and make them less wordy. You should use simple backgrounds that are consistent. So you don't want to go from white background to black background to a picture to white background again. You don't want to do that. Whatever you decide to do, you should kind of reproducibly do that throughout your entire presentation. Now, a lot of people will use colored backgrounds, or they will use those kind of custom sort of artsy backgrounds that will come with PowerPoint. And those are okay to a degree, but usually I would recommend a simple white background or a black background will work best. Some evidence suggests that white backgrounds may be a little bit better to enhance learning. Also, I've heard that black backgrounds typically make things seem a little bit more formal and look a little bit nicer. So you can kind of decide which direction you want to go, but I would typically recommend white or black solid backgrounds. Another key feature of your background is you want to make sure that it's not so busy or so interesting that it's competing with the content. So it's oftentimes good to have a background that will, well, for example, if we go back a slide, you can see this particular background image is partially blurred out. So the whole left-hand side doesn't actually really have much of a distraction. There's just a little bit of color there. If the whole background was, say, a maze, that would not be something you would want to have text on top of. So you want to make your backgrounds clear and make sure they don't compete with the content on your slide. You should paint your audience a picture. I like this slide too because it always reminds me that people tend to be rather visual. Certainly I know I'm rather visual, and I like to have pictures on my slides. And pictures are not essential, but they oftentimes are helpful towards conveying a message or to maintaining or capturing the audience's attention. So where do you go if you want a nice picture that looks something like this on your background? Well, there are several places. One is you could make it yourself. That's kind of the first and maybe most obvious answer. Another answer, and what most people tell me they do, is to use Google. You'll use Google, you'll search, do an image search, find images that way. That's certainly a great way to go about doing it. But one thing I would suggest if you are using Google is to use the filter that will search for only a particular size. I will typically look only at the larger sized images, and the reason is because if you take a smaller image and try to stretch it out across the background, it will tend to look rather pixelated and it doesn't look very good. Here's some other places that I typically will oftentimes find good pictures for science presentations. This includes the Science Photo Library, which will offer sort of some pictures for free, a number of pictures you have to pay for. It will also, you can also find a ton of pictures that are really nice on Flickr Commons. Specifically, the Flickr Creative Commons offers pictures where as long as you provide a brief reference, people are more than happy if you use those images. You can find pictures of essentially anything you can imagine on there. And what I really like about Flickr is the images are very large and they're oftentimes very nice. Wikimedia Commons, a lot of people like that as well. That's certainly a good place to go. And it's not listed here, but another good place is to actually look at papers themselves. So if you're giving a science presentation, of course, it almost goes without saying that you would want to be taking tables or figures or images from those papers, again, referencing them appropriately. Don't use blurry images, and generally stay away from clip art. I will admit that I do use clip art on occasion. There are certain images that I like, but typically not the little cute cartoony ones. They just don't look very professional. And another thing, if you're kind of like me and you're not necessarily the greatest at creating a color scheme, like I said, typically a simple high contrast color scheme where it's white text on black or vice versa typically works very, very well. But you can also set specific color schemes using this really neat tool here called the Cooler Color Wheel. It's a free tool that's online that Adobe offers. And what it lets you do is to upload any image you want, and it will automatically find nice colors that match that image very well. Or you can start with a color and find out all these other colors that just happen to go well in a visually appealing manner, just with a few simple drags of a little wheel or a little slider on that page. It's a very nice page. I suggest you check it out. Last but not least, on this slide, definitely don't forget about those who may be red-green colorblind. I wouldn't have a lot of key information in just red or green, especially I wouldn't have red or green on the same figure if at all possible. Generally, minimizing bullets is definitely a good thing. This goes along with what we've been saying all along. Minimize text, minimize groups of items on a page. A lot of people will kind of bullet you to death almost, no pun intended, where they'll have many separate bullets on the same PowerPoint slide, making it very confusing and very wordy. That's not what you want. You don't want to do that. Instead, what you want to do is think to yourself, ask yourself, what message do I want to convey? And how can I say that as succinctly as possible? And that's really all you want to say on that particular slide. You don't need, any more bullets than about 4 or 5 is probably pushing it. So just a heads up, minimize the number of bullets you use. Maximize the white space you have. So white space is essentially empty space. It does not actually have to be white. It can be any color. But it's essentially places on the slide that give the eye a place to rest. It's places that have essentially nothing filling them, so it's very easy for the brain to quickly grasp what's going on. The opposite of maximizing white space is making a slide that is too busy, and you don't want slides that are too busy because there's too much going on and it makes it very hard to see what's happening. Now, one thing that someone once told me is that PowerPoint slides are free. They don't actually cost you anything. So if you want to, you can use lots and lots of slides to get at this issue of trying to get more white space. Another thing that you should be thinking about is checking your alignment. So if you look at this slide, at first it's maybe not clearly wrong, but this box here is definitely not centered. Of course, it's labeled not centered to make it very easy. If we center it, you can see there it's centered both vertically now and horizontally. Looks a lot nicer. I used to think this didn't matter a whole lot, and I would position things manually quite a bit, but I've since come to the realization that when something is centered, it just naturally has a much better look to it. So I strongly recommend doing that. Another thing, when you have lots of groups of items on a page, you may end up having something somewhat like this, maybe not quite so obvious, but clearly these boxes are misaligned. They're different sizes, they're not lined up with one another, so to correct that, simply make sure everything is aligned and in order, and it will look much better on the final slide that you're ultimately trying to create. So this brings us to the very end of this series of 4 videos about how to give a good scientific presentation. And this brings us to our take-home messages. We have our dog of science there delivering our take-home messages. And these are take-home messages not just for this presentation, but for all 4 presentations, just as kind of a reminder of some of the key things we talked about. Number 1 is that good presentations are going to require a lot of planning and organization. So there should be a lot that you do before you're actually up in front of a whole bunch of people explaining what it is that you want to say. Secondly, focus on your message, or perhaps a few messages. You don't want to have more than 4, and it's oftentimes good just to have between 1 and 3 messages if possible. You should speak loud and clearly and pace yourself. I know one thing that I'm guilty of sometimes is talking a bit too fast. So sometimes, if you're like me, it helps to have little reminders in your slide or on your note cards, if you like to use note cards, that you should slow down at this particular spot, or you should speak louder, just in case you've fallen into the trap of not doing those things. And finally, with regards to this presentation, you should make sure that you present your message with clear thought ahead of time about the slide design, making your slides look pretty and attractive and making them memorable. So when people do come away and they're having conversations around the water cooler about your presentation, they're only going to have good things to say. So I, of course, can't actually answer your questions because this is a video, but I did want to add this slide in here just to point out that it's a very good idea at the very end of any presentation to have some sort of a question slide that will invite questions from the audience. You can make it somewhat humorous like this, or you can have a very simple one. But in any case, it's a really good thing that you can do unless of course you're doing a video, which is what I'm doing today. That's it. That's all we have. Hope you enjoyed these 4 presentations. Stay tuned. There may be a few follow-up videos where we actually get to see some presentations in action, and you'll get to decide if things are going well or things are perhaps not going so well. So until then.